Hello,
Thank you
can
for
you hear me
coming.
at the back?
So we'll start, or if you want us to explain the saga you've had getting here
Well,
today.
I almost had to cancel because on the way in, I had to come by cab because I've got sciatica. And the cab driver said, look, there's just no way through because of pride. Which is a metaphor, which you'd reject if you were writing something. Well, I can't get through because there's all these straight people in the way. But in the end, he had to plead with a copper at the embankment. And we had to come through at 5 miles an hour with our hazards on. So that extends the metaphor a bit. But yeah, that kind of summed it all up, really. But here I am, we made it.
Thank you for coming. So I'm not sure how many people have already read Gay Shame, so if you brought a copy, I'm sure you can. I've got my copy to sign.
Yes,
so,
yeah.
So I'm going to mention a few bits that you obviously talk about in the book that I found interesting, or we'll take questions as well. But you talk about assuming someone else is going to do something about this issue about gender identity and whatever. So what made you want to do something, or what led you to writing the book?
I think it was just the fact that nobody seemed to be doing anything. That I honestly kept thinking, well, somebody usually does something about this sort of thing when something happens, when thalidomide happened, or when eugenics was on the menu, or when lunchtime lobotomies was a big craze. Well, somebody steps up and does something, don't they? It's not my job. I mean, in a way, although I did a bit of sort of activism in the 80s around HIV and AIDS and lesbian and gay rights, then I remember thinking, well, there is a gay rights movement, there is an organization or organizations of people that are doing stuff. So there will inevitably be something like that. And it just didn't happen. And it just kept getting worse. And I remember the night that Alison Bailey did her fateful tweet about forming what became the LGBT Alliance. I remember sort of going to bed that night, and this was like, I think 2018, and just thinking, oh, thank God. By then, I had already come out quite spectacularly by making a joke on Twitter about how trans women tend to take on the glamorous aspects of femininity. So I was already, over the top, as it were. And what happened particularly with this book was that, I've been writing on this subject for a while, occasionally on socials and obviously in articles and things. And an editor at Forum Press just got in touch with me one day out of the blue and just said, look, this seems to be a subject that you're really interested in. Nobody else is writing about it, particularly the gay male angle. And just said, do you want to go for it? And I thought about it and went, yeah, I do. And it was one of those things where, because initially you look at it and you think, oh, I've got a word count of 80,000 words. Can I really stretch it to, oh my God, 10 minutes later, it was like pouring out. And it's often like that with writing. You think, well, I'm not sure I can get as much out of this as I think. And then, as soon as you start thinking about it and unpicking about it, you realize this is a huge subject. So that's how it came about, really.
I think a lot of people said about when you start talking to people about the issue broadly, there's so much that you can talk about. It feels like,
and also, it's cliche, but when you write and when you talk, you think. You think it starts different processes working in your head. So you actually start thinking as you're talking and thinking as you're writing. And so conversation and writing are really helpful in honing your ideas and making you realize what's going on, what you actually think.
And on that, you talk about gay men not talking about ourselves.
Yeah.
And do you think, or to what extent do you think that not talking about ourselves means we're not thinking and the kind of going along with the ideology?
I think a big extent, actually, yeah. I'd sort of forgotten that. I think, oh, that's actually a really good point. But yeah, it always struck me as a bit odd that we sort of assumed what gayness was and what male homosexuality is in the modern world and didn't really think about it very much. And we still don't, I think, in a way. So that we kind of, just sort of assume that, this happens and that happens. And, you know, male homosexuality is a sort of morally neutral, culturally neutral thing that appears everywhere. So it's going to express itself differently in our culture as it would in any other culture, specific to that place and time. And I think sometimes we just don't think about or talk about what it means. And we kind of use templates for straight people. I mean, you know, there's all these gay characters on TV and they're all the same, you know. It just feels frustrating that it's like there's no, I mean, I think I say in the book that, you know, we don't have a sort of a cultural model for what relationships between men are like. You know, we don't have, you know, the sort of idea, you know, cliches, but the cliches that straight people have, you know, about sort of, you know, the nagging wife and all that kind of thing. We just don't have any of that. We're sort of making it up as we go along. Yeah. And that's odd that we don't talk about those things, but we talk about loads of other rubbish, you know, like, ephemeral things, and also, you know, about trans and gender and all this rubbish, you know.
We had that, well, you say it in the book, but when do you think that window was between being gay or being homosexual, being accepted and kind of getting rights, and we haven't really had time, big enough window to come to terms with that and understand ourselves in that before LGBTQ took over. Yeah. So what would you say that window is?
It seemed to be about, I mean, it varies from different people, because for me in the 90s, being in my 20s, that felt like, whoa, this is different. But I hear from younger people, younger blokes, that it wasn't that different. So it's hard to say, but I mean, for me, I remember going to being at the Vauxhall Tavern in about 2004, I think about then, and David Hoyle, the Divine David, was on stage, sort of alternative cabaret performer, and taking questions from the audience. And one of them was somebody saying, what do you think the young teenage or young 20s gay people of today have in common with the, you know, the veterans, the sort of people of our age who were around in the 80s and 90s? And David Hall said, nothing whatsoever. They can have no idea of what happened because they are living in a completely different world. And I remember thinking, wow, that's true. And it's really great. But at the same time, that's really strange. And then what seemed to happen was, you know, just a few years later, for whatever reason, I've tried to work out why, but it's so hard to narrow it down, that the sort of craze of victimhood spread over everybody and everything. And so suddenly you had the coming of gender and the sort of self-traumatization of those people, which was really peculiar. So I think it's sort of, you can look at sort of the 2000s, I suppose, the noughties, as kind of that sort of golden spot, that sweet spot. I think that's when it was, yeah.
And from both from your experience and from the work you've done researching on the book and stuff, what do you think, if we'd not been overtaken by LGBTQ, and been able to have those conversations, understanding of ourselves, what would that have led to? What would
I'm not sure, because it's so unexplored. It's so hard to know where it would go. I mean, the obvious thing, looking back at it, that should have happened, I think, in the alternative timeline where genderism didn't arise in the way it has, is that the gay rights organizations and charities in the West should have looked across the world, because, you know, we're sort of talking about trans women in Scotland and all this stuff, and you think, well, actually, there are gay men being tortured, murdered, thrown off buildings across the world, you know. And that is what I think Stonewall and all those things should have started looking towards. But again, the problem there is the cultural aspects of that, where you don't want to come over as a Western person criticizing other cultures. You know, it's all, but that is the way I think it should have gone. But yeah, it's so hard to know culturally, because who's going to go first? It's such a risky, dangerous area, you know. And also, you have the problem with culturally in that the kind of people that are creators of culture are a bit odd. And so then they're not going to be, they're always going to be drawn to the transgressive or the naughty, or the, you know, the sort of the 1990s queer angle of gayness, which is fine. But you're sort of left in a sort of a catch-22 really, because I can't, I don't know what would have happened because it never happened.
Is that, or how it makes me think of something else. You've talked about that distinction between celebrating gay, the stereotype, and accepting homosexuality.
Yeah,
it's just same-sex attraction.
Yeah, which is the basic boiled down. That's what it is, and you can add whatever things onto that, but they're not the actual thing. You know, it's and then you get ridiculous things like, I don't know if you saw today, the lesbian tent at Glastonbury, which is just full of blokes. And you know, and this is the sort of endpoint, or one of the stations of adding things to something that are not it. And it's just bizarre, you know, to see all these straight people and blokes in those spaces. It's like, what on earth? You know, I sort of preferred it when we were sort of like herded into the Bell with its blacked out windows, and you know.
So if gay men haven't been talking about ourselves and kind of not been paying attention to what's going on, or a lot of people, I really like to talk about we've kind of accepted the terms and conditions without actually reading them first, of what adding the T and the Q has meant. So do you think that gay men are going along, or most gay men, obviously there's a room full of gay men who aren't going along with it here, but that gay men have gone along with it, or why have gay men gone along with it? Is it actually believing stuff, or is it just being nice, or is it just not paying attention to the terms and conditions?
I think it's all of those things. I think the major driver, and you can't ever sort of overestimate this, and it's a human factor, is people just want a quiet life. And if there are worries, then like me, they'll be thinking somebody else will do something about that. And it gulps by increments, you know, by tiny stages and little outrages, until they're just coming by at a rate of knots and you don't even notice. I mean, I think I saw about 3 or 4 things yesterday which made me go, what the? And any one of those things, had they happened in 2002, would have kept me going for days of outrage. But because there's now like about 6 a day, so in terms of why, it's another cliche, I'm afraid, but it is the perfect storm situation. You know, where a storm has to have all those climatic conditions to occur. So you had all kinds of things happening at the same time. You had inevitably social media happening in about, you know, early 2010s coming on. I mean, that I know correlation is not causation, but the sheer sort of mania of politics and culture in general at around the same time as that has got to be connected, I think. And the terrible effect it's had on mental health of kids. And I think another major factor in the States and here was that so many of the gay rights charities, organizations had kind of achieved their aim domestically. So we had things like equal marriage and legal parity and all those kind of things. So they had a lot of money and all their campaigning and structural organizations set up, and they needed a new cause. And one of the really interesting things in another book, which I really recommend, The Women Who Wouldn't Wished, the book about the Scottish women's resistance to gender, that has a timeline at the beginning, which is meticulous. And what's really interesting is that that sort of encroachment by gender and genderism and trans starts in a tiny, tiny way in about 1998. It's starting to creep in, and then the pressure builds up. And you look at was it Ben Summerskill was the CEO of Stonewall, and he resisted that pressure because Pink News with Ben Cohen, they'd been heavily transed really early on, and they were pushing for Stonewall to trans, and Ben Summerskill resisted. Ruth Hunt then told a lot of people to their face that she wouldn't do it, which is how she became the CEO, and immediately did it. And I remember about that time, so 2014, just going to text someone about something and going to use LGB or gay or something, and then just thinking, well, I better add the T because everyone else is. That's what it is now, isn't it? And I just didn't think. And I think that's how it gets in people's thought. It just sort of slides in without you noticing. And something as ludicrous as a man can declare himself to be a woman under any circumstances, it can't be challenged, and then to all intents and purposes, he is a woman. I mean, that slips in, suddenly saying no becomes unsayable, and you have the mess we're in now.
Yeah. I think, like, talking about those sorts of examples and issues now, I mean, there are definitely those of us who realise how crazy it all is and are doing something or saying something.
Yeah.
Why aren't any of the prominent gay men saying anything?
Well, I think prominent generally means prominent gay men. Here they are. Prominent gay men, well, most of the prominent gay men in public life in the UK are either politicians or they're in the media out front. Now, the cultural world, the world of publishing and television and film and all those kind of things, oh, yeah, no, that is, you know, that is really, really strongly, staunchly genderized. It's so esoteric in its opinions generally. It's so disconnected that any kind of slightly different opinion gets you funny looks. I mean, I remember once going to a meeting at the BBC, and I'd been staying at a hotel, and I just picked up the Daily Telegraph, you know, from the sort of food bag, and was reading it in the taxi, got to the meeting. Everyone was like, oh my God. As if I sort of walked in clan robes, you know. And it's that kind of behavior, you know, that, and you find that the higher that gets, the more on screen that gets, the more extreme it gets. So again, I remember when Gordon Brown did his bigoted woman gaff, I was on set, the BBC show that day, and all the crew were in hysterics thinking this is the funniest thing that's ever happened, you know. As you went up into the echelons of the executives, they were all like, well, she was a bigoted woman. Why is everyone laughing? So again, it's that kind of groupthink and that kind of conformity. So I think a prominent gay man would take an enormous amount of flack. I mean, you look at James Dreyfus on Twitter, the actor. I mean, he just gets it all the time, you know. And I think for a gay male pop star or comedian or any of those things to come forward would take an enormous stretch, even now, even post Cass report. So I think that's why, I mean, I know that a quite famous gay singer has read my book and rather loves it.
Sign up and come to so yeah, it's hard to think who would our equivalent of J.K. Rowling be, but what do you think the both in media and ongoing impact if we had a gay K Rowling?
That would be amazing. I mean, John Boyne, the writer, I mean, he's fairly well known, Irish writer, was good. He's sort of done it, but you have to be, in a way, as mega rich and mega famous and mega powerful as JK to be able to do that, because, and John Boyne's sort of just into that sphere, I think. I think if somebody else was to do it, you know, if, I mean, not that they would, but if, just trying to think of somebody, it's hard to think of them, but it's so much easier to just take the shilling and roll with it. And I mean, the worst thing is people that don't believe a word of it and still go along with it.
Yeah.
And I know I've had a few of those as well. Who are all like, oh God, isn't it awful? LGBT. Yeah. And there's a special place in hell reserved for them.
Yeah. I think those, we're unlikely to get those sorts of people to at least publicly change their mind or say anything different. For those people who've been going along with it, either, you know, trying to be kind or be nice or haven't really realised all those sorts of things. You talk about the golden bridge in the book. Do you want to just
you have to, I mean, it is very annoying when people do this, but when they start saying things like, oh, I didn't realise, you have to sort of kind of go, yeah, great, good on you. Because, I mean, I think if anyone's still going along with it now, they're either an idiot or a maniac. a sociopath, basically. And I think it's much better to be an idiot, even to pretend to be an idiot if you've been a sociopath, and then that's the way to get out of it. I never realised. And one really interesting thing I've noticed recently is quite a lot of the gender people and their sort of allies, including in the Labour Party, have started, including Starmer, have started saying, "Oh, this toxic debate." Both sides now. That's really fucking annoying. But the significant thing is, it's the first acknowledgement they've ever made that the gender side might be a bit nutty. So although it's very annoying, and Rishi Sunak yesterday sending out thing out going, gender ideology should not be taught in schools. Wow, well done. Yeah. You know, I wonder who could have allowed it to be. Yeah. So all that stuff is very annoying, particularly, you know, when it's like election time. Yeah. But in a way, we've got to kind of say, great, thank you, come along. Yeah. Yes, isn't it awful? So many people are like you and they didn't realise, rather than go, oh, for fuck's sake, where have you been? You know, we can do that, you know, behind their backs to ourselves. Yeah.
And mentioning elections, and we just because we've talked, a couple of people said about Biden today.
Yeah, I'm trying not to do that.
Do you think, or how much do you feel or think that actually Labour getting in here could be our Biden era, in that it'll go so woke, it'll peak everyone?
Well, I've heard peculiar and conflicting things about this from different people. Some people I've spoken to think that a hung parliament is the worst thing that could happen about gender. Yeah. Because although everyone's saying there's going to be a major Labour landslide, not sure. But a hung parliament where Labour had to rely on the Greens and the Lib Dems is kind of exactly what happened to the SNP and got them into such trouble. Now, you could take the accelerationist view and say, great, let's let it all blow up in their faces, which is tempting, but it wouldn't be pretty and there would be a lot of trouble. With a large Labour majority, perversely, then probably much more likely to be able to go, oh, now we've looked at the facts and changed our minds, and drop it quietly, which is what they're going to do about loads of things. You know, I think there was that thing about, you know, they're trying that sort of age-old election technique of before the election, or just after the election, actually, usually, but they've done it before, of going, well, now we've opened up the public accounts, and my God, it's much worse than we thought. We're going to have to put up all your taxes. And then they're now training that before. Oh, we might find when we get here, you know. So, you know, and Keir Starmer is not a man that, I mean, the sort of curse and blessing of him is that you can't believe a word he says. And his pledges are just, I mean, it's a cliche of politicians, but for him, it's just incredible. The platform he stood on to win the leadership, to get those Corbyn backers with him, is so different to what he's saying now. So it makes you wonder what he thinks and what he's for. One thing I think you can say about him is that he doesn't like unnecessary bother. And I think that this might prove bothersome if there's any way he can get round people being grilled all the time about this, he'll probably take it. But who knows? There could, I mean, you know, there could be 300 new Labour MPs who are all mental this time next week.
So we all just have to be more bothersome than the other side, basically.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the truisms of campaigning, unfortunately, isn't it? You have to make politicians groan more than your opponents. You have to make them go, oh, no, not them. Shut them up, I don't care how. Bombard them with faxes, as people used to in the old days.
Is there anyone who would like to ask any question to Gareth? Yes, it's on front here.
Well, we're talking about Labour. What about Wes Streeting? So he's a gay man, used to work for Stonewall, and he somehow understands this, I think, and is starting to say, why he doesn't tell Keir Starmer how to answer a question. I don't know, but...
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting one because he's also making slightly courageous noises about other things, the NHS and things like that. And it's interesting with Wes because he is quite a good barometer. He's a good weather vane you know, wherever Wes is pointing at that particular point is where the wind is blowing. So the fact that he started to turn away from genderism is kind of interesting, because whatever he is, he's got a nose for this sort of thing. Now, in power, that might change. And also, again, because of all those loopy potential new Labour MPs, they might try and get rid of Wes Streeting pretty quickly. The civil service, if he starts trying to fiddle around with things, might take the same attitude to him as they did to the Tories and to the previous Labour government of just obstructing them and not letting them change anything at all. So that he's quite an interesting character. I also quite like his voice because it makes me think of the Black Cap in 1985. The sort of oh really? Oh, I'm really sad about that.
Yes, question there.
Gareth, I read your book and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I wonder something different. I wonder if what you think about Helen Joyce's good point, that actually wherever you look, there is someone prominent. So in any company, any corporation, institution, if someone's prominent who's trans their child or has something involved and can't say or do anything. And that seems to me is very true in politics as well, because Stephen Kinnock has a daughter, stroke, son, stroke, non-binary. Penny Morton's twin brother is a trans activist. But no one ever says that.
I think people,
So I'm wondering if, I completely objected to people being outed in the 90s. Thatcher did it a few times, and he said he did it when they were being critical. And I agree you shouldn't do that. But I wonder how do we make people talk about that more so that that becomes a non-issue?
it is difficult, but for exactly the reason you say, because people don't want to go onto the ground of other people's kids and then criticising their parenting. I mean, Helen Joyce, I don't know if you heard her, she was on LBC or Sky or somewhere the other day, and she was asked about David Tennant, and she kind of had to swerve around and go, I'm not going to talk about David Tennant, but there are celebrities who, etc., which I think is probably the way of doing it. I think Yvette Cooper and Ed Balls have got one as well. And it is turning into, I mean, you know, if Ab came back, you know, Safi's daughter now, my God, and Eddie will be like, yes. It is just a middle-class accessory, and it's quite distressing. As with a lot of things, it's simultaneously really horrific and quite funny, which is a terrible thing. But it is incredibly difficult to start criticizing other people's parenting. I mean, I know someone whose son has been sort of, he's non-binary at the moment, and she's just like going, right, okay, if I can just keep the lid on it. But I mean, if she was to object, all hell would break loose. So you do feel for the parents there as well. But what's happened is that all these things could have been solved if there had been a very firm no said at the very beginning. So if you say no, non-binary is ridiculous, no, men can't change into women. If that had been stated very clearly early on and those barriers put down, then none of this stuff could have crept in. But we are where we are. But I think what Helen did was the best way of doing it. Okay. Far be it from me to say there's anything terrible about the parenting of Ed Balls and Yvette Cooper. But let's just say, for example, that, you know, there's this couple of former politicians. Maybe one of them has been on Strictly, and sort of take it from there. Really, I think that's the way to do it.
Have a question?
Yeah, so I have a question, probably basic. Ideological plague of radical gender theory that's in institutions.
Yeah.
A lot of, I guess, the word ideology. Would you say that there's any hope for Gen Z? Do you think there's any hope for those homosexuals in Gen Z who feel embrace this connection with radical gender theory?
I think there is. It's always, as always, it's so hard to tell. I mean, I remember when my generation were the terrible, scary generation of weirdness, and it was literally about 3% of us. And it was laughable, you know, to be in it, to, you know, you go, for people, you saw older people going, you know, oh, Network 7 will be the death of civilization, or, you know, Bananarama, and as always, and this is, but it's gone right into Mega Drive this time round. There is a real disconnect between what we think young people are like and what they actually are like, which we're starting to see recently with some of like Farage's popularity, or however good or bad that might be on these forums and sites. A lot of the time, and again, this is one of the reasons that people hung back for a long time, was we assume that, you know, fads will pass, but they're not going to bed in. And a lot of people with general woke stuff were saying, well, you know, this will die a death. We sort of had it a bit in the 90s and it filtered away. And it hasn't yet. But in the long term, and I don't know how long, I think you'll always have a problem with reality. But you know, the facts are on the side of reality. And that can be really painful when it hits. But you know, men aren't women. You know, men can't be lesbians. All the really, really obvious things will just keep smacking people in the face. And hopefully some of that is filtering down to that younger generation. But as always, as I say, it's so hard to tell, because the idea that we have of what young people are like is, I think, probably quite inaccurate. You see this in the, you know, the fact that the culture for young people, the stuff that's aimed at them doesn't do very well, because it's sort of very woke and they don't care. You know, they'd rather play horribly violent video games, as always.
One more question and then we'll stop the break. Yeah.
There's one aspect to this whole zeitgeist thing that just confused me, which is this appearance of the issue of conversion therapy almost out of the blue. I mean, that was never an issue in the 1980s.
Yeah.
There was no, I mean, I'm old enough to have known one or two people who went to see a psychiatrist because they didn't want to be gay. But it never worked, and it sort of just almost disappeared, and then suddenly out of the blue it becomes this major moral issue amongst people who I think could quite relate to. Is it entirely a Trojan Horse?
I think it probably is, actually, yeah, to be honest. I mean, I think there were a few cases, and I think the influence of America, where it is more of a thing because of their totally different society and culture, I think that sort of seeped over here. And as happens a lot of the time, we just take on American culture and their sort of attitude to all manner of political things. And when in fact our history is completely different, our culture is completely different. But yes, it was very noticeable. But you know, about that time that I'm talking about, sort of early 2010s, that you suddenly had MPs, and they always say this, the abhorrent practice of conversion therapy. You know, like Theresa May was awful, like the abhorrent practice of conversion therapy. I think what happened was that it gave politicians something to say to make the gays happy. And they got married now, they can enter the armed forces, and they can do this, they can do that. If they die, then will now goes to their partner. I know the abhorrent practice of conversion therapy. And it is utterly bizarre. I mean, like you say, I mean, I'm of an age, and I remember somebody a bit older than me that I worked with in the 80s saying, oh, I went to a psychiatrist, and this must have been in the 60s, saying, oh, I don't want to be homosexual. And he said, well, don't come to me, you are. There's nothing you can do about it. Enjoy it. So yeah, it is very strange, and actually, you're making me think this is something I should have covered in the book. Maybe, where did this idea come from, or how did it get into British discourse? You know, why are there always people going on? You know, it's like about something that doesn't actually exist, and it does make you think, well, the reason that it's there is because it has to be trans inclusive. So basically you're inventing and establishing and legalizing gay conversion therapy. Yeah, I think that's it, yeah.
Well, it's been really interesting. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Everyone for joining me, thanking Gareth for his time.